The land of Equestria is a peaceful haven of mankind, though it was not always like that. Thousands of years ago, humans had to contend with harsh northern winters and constantly warring with one another. Peace only truly came upon the lands of Equestria after the unification of the Equestrian tribes under one ruler, Princess Celestia. Or at least that is how the old story goes. That did not stop some from trying to disturb the peaceful life of Equestrians. The tyrannical Queen Chrysalis attempted the conquest of the land, but with the combined effort of the people of Equestria and the elements of harmony, this evil was beaten back, sending Chrysalis back to the Changeling Lands. However, 7 years on, many can tell that dark clouds gather on the horizon, with the threat of a socialist revolution coming from Stalingrad from the east, and the now united Changeling Lands threatening revanche from the west. A new age dawns, an era that Equestria and its peace-loving citizens may not be ready for. It is the year 1007. The political class of Equestria is slowly coming to an understanding that the princessdom must prepare for all possibilities in the future. Industrial buildup was ordered to ensure that Equestria could stand on its own 2 feet after many centuries of peace. Equestria rested on its laurels for far too long, leaving the royal army small and unprepared to fight a serious enemy. On the political front, it was decided that someone should do something about the deteriorating situation in the Kingdom of Alania. The illegitimate King Johann was less and less able to hide the state of Alania, with it becoming more evident that both the state and society of Alania is rapidly falling apart. Equestrian leadership approached the exiled legitimate heir, Velvet, to offer her protection until equestrian intervention was possible. However, events quickly spiraled out of Johann's control, with the country collapsing into civil war. Velvet had no time for hiding, instead opting into returning to her country to rally the people into a united front against the tyrant. Naturally, the Equestrian army has intervened to speed up the outcome of this civil war. The special forces were deployed into the country, managing to meet no resistance, thus helping the now Queen Velvet win the civil war much faster than she could on her own otherwise. Internally, societal changes were happening in Equestria, with efforts being made by Princess Luna to change society's attitude to be more accepting of minorities, with the helping hand of the elements of harmony and her elder sister. Slowly but surely, these changes had started to take effect, with harmony triumphant over segregation. By the beginning of winter, to secure the northern flank of Equestria, it was decided to increase military presence in Equestria's closest ally, the Crystal Empire. However, news came that the once overthrown tyrannical King Sombra used the increasing influence over the country to rally support against the pro-Equestrian reign of Princess Cadance, resulting in her having to flee the country, just barely avoiding a fate worse than death at the hands of the restored tyrant. Naturally, this threat could not be allowed to continue existing, only to keep gathering more strength to go to war with Equestria either way. The immediate response to this obvious menace was the re-establishment of a Ministry of Defense, which has been abolished for many centuries now, but now Equestria had to pick up the sword instead of the flower to defend itself, its interests and citizens. A preemptive strike was called for, and thus, on May 17th of 1008, the small Equestrian army was ordered to march across the border. The army of the Crystal Empire was ever so slightly bigger than Equestria's, leading to Equestria's first ever recruitment campaign in many centuries. This proved to be a peer-to-peer conflict, as both armies inflicted serious losses on each other and made mutual incursions into each other's territory. But soon enough, with some clever maneuvering, Sombra's army was quickly reduced to being no more than a glorified insurgency, performing hit-and-run attacks after letting the bulk of an Equestrian division pass by. As it always is in war, civilian casualties have already occurred, causing some discontent among the people of Equestria. Anti-war writings quickly came to the attention of Celestia, taking the decision to implement wartime censorship. There was no peace with an enemy like Sombra. Crystal City was taken without a fight, with the Royal Army only being met with a weak counterattack. In September of 1008, all Sombra's forces have capitulated unconditionally. The rightful Crystal government has been restored. The Royal Army leadership, despite the undeniable success of the operation, was driven into a deep state of concern for the future of the armed forces. This operation has revealed many problems within the military. The primary concern of the General Staff was the lack of any serious firepower in every division. Military reforms were desperately needed. The first thing that had to change quickly was the attitudes of the soldiers themselves, as not only were they poorly trained, but combined with their almost paranoidal fear of trenches and lack of familiarity with armor, it made the Equestrian army almost useless if Sombra had a more serious force. What added to the concern was the war that was going on between the Changelings and Olanians. Chrysalis used the opportunity to conquer Olania while Equestria was too busy fighting in the Crystal Lands. One of the better performing units in the Crystal operation were the Special Forces, provided slightly better training than the regular army. It was decided that operations in the future will be executed with a heavy emphasis on these specialist forces. These forces were entrusted to the command and personal loyalty of Princess Luna. In February of 1008, Olania has fallen to the Changeling onslaught, Queen Velvet escaping to Equestria, creating an exiled government. Equestrian leadership understood well that the next likely target will be Equestria itself. Military and industrial buildup had to be sped up if the Royal Army was to be prepared to handle such a foe. In order to be aware of potential threats, the intelligence agency SMILE was established, with agents being sent to monitor changeling movements across the border. These agents went into what was commonly accepted to be a one-way trip full of dangers. In the aftermath of the Crystal operation, Equestria, for the first time in centuries, introduced conscription. Previously, the entire military was based on volunteer service, but the operation revealed that even those who choose to enlist were mentally unprepared for the realities of modern warfare. This did not bode well for the general populace, which did not see war in many generations. To prepare for a confrontation with the Changeling army, a lengthy line of defense was constructed along the border. In August of 1011, agents from all over Changelingia have sent reports of increasing movement of Changeling forces all across the country, all eventually coming to the border regions of Equestria. What was noticed by naval patrols is that the bulk of the enemy armor formations are concentrated in the Olanian border towns. Equestrian generals were convinced that these forces will move by land into Equestria straight into Vancouver. Things looked to be not as bad as it seemed for the Equestrian border forces. In accordance with this special operations-focused doctrine, the special forces have been redeployed out of Vancouver to the soon-to-be front. On the 15th of September of 1011, the changelings began their invasion. The Great War has begun. Seeing how few enemy forces were at their border, the Crystal Army began offensive actions trying to invade the Changeling lands themselves. But soon enough, confusion spread all across the front, as communication lines were suddenly cut and radio silence befell many towns along the border regions. Jaegers of the Changeling army surrounded Vancouver, special forces being rapidly redeployed to intercept them. But it was already too late, as Changeling armor, rather than crossing the border on land, traveled across the sea to Vancouver, flooding the formed gap in Equestrian defenses. Deep within Equestria, local commanders began forming what defenses they could before the enemy could approach this far into the country. Despite the gallant defense performed by the border forces, everyone quickly understood that with the gap created by the Changelings' Vancouver operation, it was pointless to try hold on to the initial front line, with a strategic retreat being necessary. For a time, it worked, as the Changelings had to first reach the new contact line. The new central node in this improvised defense was the city of Tall Tale and the small town of Woodsville. The Royal Army had to hold out until the fallback line could be brought to a usable state. In late November, it became clear that the crisis of draft dodgers must be dealt with. Celestia ordered the harshest possible measures. This was a war which Equus had never seen before. Every able-bodied person had to contribute to the fight.
Stellung gehen. Feuer!
Despite all efforts, Tall Tale was lost, making the defense of Woodsville pointless. Another retreat was ordered. By December, the forward defense line was already penetrated, meaning that by the time the changelings arrive at the fallback line, the defense will not be adequate enough to stop them. To keep up high morale, musicians across the country began patriotic performances. Most notable of those was held in Manhattan. By the end of the year, the changelings halted their southern operations, focusing mostly on what was dubbed the Central Front. Despite all preparations, the enemy managed to breach the defenses in some areas, with Royal Army counterattacks proving useless as its changelings reinforced their gained territory. By March of 1012, divisions from the border with Stalingrad were moved towards the front to stop for future changeling attacks, even though that opened the possibility of an attack from behind. By April, the front was completely stabilized. Feeling confident in finally being able to stop the enemy in their tracks, High Command began planning a counter-offensive operation. What added to the confidence is that the soldiers no longer complained of being afraid to fight, and even stopped being afraid of tanks. They were now capable of going at the enemy without fear. The first counter-offensive of the Royal Army came in May, with the goal of liberating Yonder Hill. Officials came to Celestia asking what to do in regards to martial law. It was decided that despite how unpleasant it is, it's a necessity when fighting the kind of war Equestria found itself in now. However, it was also decided as official policy that the moment the war is over, the state will then return to its peaceful ways. As well as that, because of the necessities of wartime, it gave the princes the chance to bypass much of the traditional bureaucracy and reform it to fit current needs. The Special Forces have been redeployed for a new offensive operation, Operation Silverback. This involved a raid along the enemy-occupied coastline, with a ground operation going from the south towards Tall Tale, reaching around the changing armies from behind. By February of 1013, the plans for the naval raid were finalized, encompassing a large spectrum of targets. On the evening of March 10th, the operation was given the green light. The Special Forces set sail guarded by the bulk of the Royal Fleet.
Knallt sie ab!
Ready for medals.
Refunds on ammunition not
Open fire! On the right! Take cover! Ready when you are! It comes.
As the first gunshots were heard on the coast of Francisco, the land stage of Operation Silverback began, with the outnumbered changelings being sent on the run. Thanks to the speed and the element of surprise, the landing forces were able to reach the front pushed by the irregular forces. In April, an offensive on a wide front was undertaken, using the distraction caused by Operation Silverback. It was a limited success, but the goal was not to push the enemy completely out of Equestria, but rather push them away from the fallback line and fully secure the approaches to Shire. However, the next day after the offensive was ordered, news came of a war declaration by Stalingrad in the early hours of April 9th. Even though the Stalingradian army was much smaller, it still presented a formidable force, which fell upon the border troops, with the Royal Army being pushed back quite far. The front line with Stalingrad quickly grew to a crisis, as there were no adequate defenses prepared against such a scenario, requiring redeployment of what could be spared from the Eastern Front. In October, the Royal Army leadership decided to pull off the same trick that they have with Operation Silverback: distract the communist forces with a naval raid, and then commence a powerful land assault. This plan was dubbed Operation Nightingale. On November 24th, Operation Nightingale began. Unlike the Changelings, who then were overconfident in their ability, the Red Army has learned from the mistakes of others, and actually guarded the occupied ports.
Пусть железо пока горячо!
land stage of the operation did not fare much better, with territory constantly going back and forth, only resulting in equestrian casualties rising. Despite all efforts, Stratosburg remained in the Reds' hands. In January, another changeling assault just barely managed to reach the sea of the eastern salient, but still failed to take back what was lost on a strategic level. By this stage in the conflict, state propaganda has done its job very well. The dehumanization of the changeling and the Red enemy has noticeably increased and amplified the voices of those who wish to completely destroy the enemy in a total war of annihilation. These far-right voices will be tolerated for the time being, but some still voice their concerns over allowing such propaganda to continue to influence the minds of equestrians. Some feared a return to distrust among equestrians themselves, especially towards minorities. In April, another offensive was undertaken against the Red Army, this time with the aid of the Crystal Imperial Army to strike at the enemy from the north. By June, the Red Army was significantly pushed back, making the impression that it was now safe to commit to a new offensive in the east. Operation Liberation began on June 21st, seeing incredible success. But it came at a cost of creating a huge deficit of almost everything in the Royal Army. Intense battles over Salt Lake City lasted many weeks.
infantry!
Es gibt Arme, Leute! Get out right!
Ziel wurde ausgeschaltet.
Ich bin getroffen!
On the 13th of October, the Royal Army reached the sea just south of occupied Vancouver. Operation Whirlwind was authorized to wipe out the trapped changeling armies. Vancouver itself was liberated for the final time.
Feindliche Einheiten gesichtet!
Feindliche Einheiten gesichtet!
Sie nähern sich nur noch!
In November, the Telltale Pocket was completely destroyed, with many enemies taken prisoner. Operation Whirlwind was a total success. In December, a new offensive began in the west with the aim of reaching the pre-war border and penetrating deep into Stalingrad. Peter's hoof has fallen. The Red Menace did not have much longer now. In February of 1015, general strikes began as the people grew tired of constant warfare, with their friends and family being either injured or killed, while they have to work 12-hour shifts to make more weapons to kill others. The propaganda campaign was intensified, reminding the people of what the changelings did to innocent people in all areas they have occupied. On March 7th, Operation Deer began, with the aim of liberating Alania. This operation was a stunning success, resulting in the occupation of a large portion of Alania, with the legitimate Alanian government now residing in Hjortland once more. By June, Stalingrad has fallen to the advancing Equestrian forces, resulting in the collapse of the Stalingradian state apparatus, quickly resulting in the occupation of the whole country. The forces that stormed the lands of Stalingrad were now tasked with occupying it until order could be restored. On August 5th, seeing that the changeling army is slowly falling apart, the Royal Army commenced Operation Rising Sun. This became a serious blow to the enemy, resulting with the siege and occupation of Vrax. Interestingly, the deeper the Royal Army advanced, the more often they found themselves fighting not the regular army they were now accustomed to, but what seemed like a militia, formed mostly of civilians. It became obvious. The changeling military is on its last legs and now relies on the old, the young, and the weak to defend their country. This inspired the soldiers of Equestria even more, seeing that their efforts and deaths are not in vain and actually are having an effect on the enemy. On November 22nd, after a short break after the recent offensive, the second stage of Operation Sun began, the dash for Vassalipolis. Despite the desperate fighting by the changelings in their capital city, it was futile, as the city fell on the 20th of December. The troops who fought and won this battle were all awarded medals for distinguished service. Chrysalis' realm was now falling apart all around her, being forced to flee to the distant port town of Sorith. There now was little changing troops to actually oppose the royal army, as most began fleeing the battlefield or surrendering en masse. The path to Detricium lay wide open. In some areas, changeling fanatics tried to continue resisting, but they were relegated to fighting in the cold, distant north, where there was nothing of value to defend anymore. In February, even Sorith was taken. At 11 AM, 7th of February of 1016, Detricium has fallen without much of a fight. The evil queen was nowhere to be found, as she was overthrown back in Sorith. Now the provisional government of the Changeling Hives approached the Equestrian delegates with a manifesto of the Changelings' unconditional surrender. The Great War was finally over. This war cost Equestria almost 4 million lives, but the soldiers, generals and Celestia made them count, so that their deaths were not for nothing. The Changeling state was put under heavy Equestrian supervision, with territories going to Olenia, Equestria and the Crystal Empire to safeguard against future aggression at any point in the future. However, not all was well in Equestrian politics for Princess Celestia. Many voices cried out for a referendum on the status of the monarchy. As the referendum showed, too many voices were in favor of a republic, but with some political machinations, Celestia managed to bargain her way into becoming a constitutional monarch, even if this now meant that she only was allowed to observe politics, rather than direct the state by her order. Equestria's first prime minister was elected in the country's first ever national election, the royal and war hero Blueblood. The years leading up to the Great War itself have shown that Celestia's guidance was not enough to protect Equestrians from war. Now that they survived the storm, even if Equestrian society was heavily bruised from it, having the memories of wartime censorship and repression still fresh in everyone's minds, the people now have the power to exercise their own authority over the political life of the country as well as their own, rather than having to listen to just one person who happens to be born with a crown. Equestria would not remain an isolationist power from now on. Instead, the new constitution vowed to protect harmony and freedom both at home and abroad. A new era dawned upon the peaceful land of Equestria. And this time, they were ready for what might come.